So this is our very last unit. It'll be the last thing that is on your final exam. So make sure you listen carefully because there are questions on the final. Even though there's not a quiz that covers this chapter, again, it's on the final. So make sure that you follow along. All right, so this is Southern Africa to the 18th century. So this will be largely what will become South Africa, the South African colony, all the way up to the point of colonization. So South Africa by the 1600s is developing like most other later Iron Age states and societies that we've talked to up until this point. Think about the agricultural changes, specifically cattle keeping, that are changing the other societies and the changes that those brought, rendering these civilizations more or less self-sufficient by this point in time. And a certain amount of interregional trade is also going on in the southernmost portion of the continent. By the 16th century, we know this, there are European sailing ships in South Africa, mainly Dutch and English ships making the voyage around the southern tip of Africa. Of course, we know that in the late 1600s, it was the Portuguese that are going to be the first who are going to make that trip. But going forward, there are a lot of Dutch and English ships that are going around South Africa. The point of this is to engage in trade with Southeast Asia and Indonesia, which the Europeans at the time referred to collectively as the East Indies. So the importance of South Africa is not just merely as a point to go around on their way to the East Indies, but also Table Bay specifically, if you look over on the map to the right, there at the tip of South Africa, where modern-day Cape Town is very important because it's roughly halfway between Europe and Asia. And by the 17th century, Table Bay is a regular port of call for ships needing to replenish. Think about the time period. We don't have refrigeration, so there's no way to keep things like meat and other perishable goods fresh. And so meat would have to be salted down. We talked about that before when we talked about salt being one of the major commodities of the trans-Saharan trade. It was used to salt down foods to keep them fresh and in age before you had a really good refrigeration system. And so they needed to replenish their meat stores and also their fresh water. Of course, being in the middle of the ocean, you don't have access to fresh water. You have access to salt water, which is worse for you than just simply going thirsty because it will deprive you of the liquids your body needs. So they need to make a stopping point here, and for that reason, it becomes very significant. So the farmers that are living there are the Khoisan farmers. We've talked about this group before. The map over there to the right gives you an idea of where the Khoisan eventually settled in South Africa. And at first, they welcomed the trading opportunities. It's a new group of people to trade items with, and that makes it a new source of potential wealth. However, the peaceful trading between the Europeans and the Khoisan ends when they try to raise prices. And when they raise prices, the Europeans turn to raiding Khoisan lands for themselves. So this brings into play the Dutch, very powerful trading monopoly, the Dutch East India Trading Company. And if you've ever taken any kind of European or even American history class, you've probably heard of the Dutch East India Trading Company before. Massively powerful. Now, they wanted to solve this problem of replenishment in South Africa by forming a small permanent European settlement around this area. This would help to ensure that there was regularized meat trade between the Khoisan and the Europeans to help keep prices down. The settlement itself would then start to grow fresh fruits and vegetables for the European sailors. And they also hoped to create a hospital for sick sailors so that they could be kept there and treated instead of, remaining on the ship and potentially getting everybody else sick. Not only would this help the sailors themselves, it would also enable them to monopolize the provisional trade that was not only needed by the Dutch, but also by other European countries and sailors that were going around this point as well. So the Dutch settlement eventually demanded more cattle than the natural surplus that existed at the point in time. The company in exchange offered only luxuries like copper, beads, tobacco, and alcohol in exchange for cattle. Now, originally they had used iron as a means of exchange, but they dropped that because they were afraid that the Khoisan would use it to make weapons against the white settlers, and guns, of course, being one of the major advantages that the Europeans had over native groups. So any Khoisan who are not willing to sell to the Europeans, sell their cattle, had their cattle forcibly seized so that the Europeans could use them to sell to other European sailing ships. Now, the Dutch East India Trading Company also allowed some soldiers to set up as independent farmers, and they were known as Boers. So they settle, they start, creating their own farms, but of course they have to settle on land that previously belonged to another group, and in this case they were settling on traditional Khoisan lands, and in response they united in armed opposition to the Boers in 1659. They were able to drive the Boers back to a fortress, but they were unable to overrun the fortress. And after a period of time in which there was a stalemate, this alliance between various Khoisan tribes eventually fell apart, and so they were unable to completely defeat the Boers, which again are the Dutch settlers who are setting up as independent farmers. So, claiming right of conquest, the Boers start to expand, and more start coming. They considered all Khoisan land to be empty land and therefore free for the taking. Because they didn't have traditional civilization as the Europeans, in this case again the Dutch specifically, would consider civilization, they figured that it's free and so we're going to take it. So the establishment of the European export market starts to slowly and steadily drain the land of indigenous livestock, because most of the livestock is being taken to trade to the European sailors. Traders and raiders are also starting to penetrate away from modern-day Cape Town and into the interior, as you can see from the map here. It gives you a general idea of the direction that the Boers took. And as they went, they really exploited a lot of the rivalries between the indigenous clans that they encountered, and played them off of each other in a similar way to that the settlers are going to use for Native American tribes when they arrive in North America. And so this starts a series of wars. The Second Co-Dutch War lasts from 1673 to 1677. We use the word war, but it's mainly a series of cattle raids. It's not necessarily like a long, sustained war that we might think of war as traditionally. And after the defeat of the Khoisan, the Boers begin to expand very rapidly. Direct emigration of Dutch settlers was allowed starting in the late 1600s, and by the early 1700s, the white population in South Africa reaches 1,000. The colony started to grow enough not only to feed themselves, but also as they grew enough for a surplus. And they started employing slaves imported from Madagascar, Mozambique, and Indonesia to work for them as well. And as time goes on throughout the 1700s, white settlement continues to expand. And as they expand, they push away from the coast and into the interior. And these original Dutch settlers in South Africa that started to expand into the interior were known as trekboers. Trek is from the Dutch word meaning to pull a wagon, because they were so often on the move. One of the reasons why it expanded so rapidly was not only because of direct immigration, but also because the Boers tended to have very large families. And each son in a family regarded it as their birthright to claim a farm of their own once they grew to adulthood. So that gives you an idea of how quickly things could expand. And as they expand again, they push further and further into the interior of South Africa. So as the Trek Boers slowly start expanding, the Khoisan have three courses of action. Number one, they could take direct military action and try to resist the incursions of white settlers on their lands. Two, they could continue to withdraw into the interior. Or three, they could accept a subservient position within Boer society, essentially as slaves. The Khoisan are at a disadvantage when it comes to the white settlers, and some move through all three actions in succession. So they start off trying to have some sort of military resistance. When that doesn't work, they withdraw to the interior, and when that doesn't work, then they become accepting of their subservient role. And the main reason for this is because the Boers have superior weapons. They have horses and they have guns, both of which are not available to the native groups of South Africa and Africa as a whole. And again, mentioned the book before, but if you're interested in kind of the development of why the Europeans had the advantage here, I highly recommend Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. It really is like the classic explanation of why this was. I'm sitting in my office looking at it right now, so it's something that I've definitely read and studied. And not only that, so going back to Guns, Germs, and Steel, the germs part, a lot of local groups were wiped out by the germs brought by the Europeans, specifically smallpox. Any direct military resistance offered by the Khoisan were usually some form of guerrilla warfare. And this was, again, something that they were forced to revert to once they were deprived of their pastoral livelihood. It forced them to revert to full-time hunting and gathering because they weren't able to raise their own cattle the way that they were able to before. And as a result, there's more hunting and raiding of the livestock of the Boers themselves. So the Trek Boers respond to this raiding of their cattle by forming militia groups that they called commandos. So remember that another alternative to military resistance was to withdraw into the interior. But the problem with that is that those that did were soon overtaken by an advancing frontier. Because again, each son of the Boers regarded it as their right to have their own land, and so they had big families, lots of sons, and in search of new land, they start pushing further and further into the interior. Throughout the 18th century, more and more Khoisan have to resign themselves to the loss of their economic and political independence, and slowly over time, they agree to work for the Boers as herdsmen and hunters. They are able to retain some access to their land. However, they were paid very little and only allowed some animals for their own keeping. And as a result of this, there was a huge loss of their cultural roots and their native language. And many have to serve with the Boers on their commando raids against their own people. So a common source of Khoisan servants are actually these orphaned, I use orphan in quotations there, children that were captured on commando raids. And I'll explain that in a second here. So these orphan children that were captured on these raids on Khoisan settlements would then be shared out amongst the commandos as apprentices, which basically meant that they were unpaid servants. And they were apprenticed to a Boer until they reached adulthood. But apprenticeship was such an important source of labor that it was a reason in and of itself for the raids. And so they would go on these raids, and in the course of that, the adults of the village might be killed, and therefore they created the orphans that they then took as apprentices to serve for their own purposes. So going forward, the Khoisan remain a part of a servile class to the Europeans. They are lumped together by the Europeans with other freed slaves and people of mixed native and European ancestry. And during the 19th century, the colonists referred to this specific population as quote-unquote Cape-colored. So as the Trek Boers start pushing into the interior and east, around the tip of South Africa, they start reaching into this the settlement of the Xhosa. They don't initially react to this group with much alarm to the European expansion. They think that the colonists will just be absorbed into their society rather than vice versa. And during the 18th century, some Boers do actually follow this route. However, the real conflict begins in the 1770s over land, and unlike the Khoisan, they actually have a pretty remarkable unity. So starting in 1779, there is the first of a series of 9 frontier wars that are going to continue for the next 100 years between these two groups. So as the Europeans push further and further into the interior, they encounter the Kalahari Desert, which is a very dry and sandy region. Not surprising, it's desert. There's a lot of lack of surface water. Again, it's a desert. And this makes it pretty unsuitable for cattle. So the people who lived here were mainly small groups of hunters and gatherers. And the maps that I provided, the one on the left gives you kind of a bird's eye view of where the Kalahari Desert is, and the one to the right gives you a close-up of South Africa. So again, it gives you an idea of where the settlement might have pushed from that southern and westernmost tip of South Africa to the east and then into the interior. So east of the Kalahari, there is a group called the Sotho-Tswana. They are part of the South African Highveld, and they develop a very complex social order prior to European advancement. They were a large political unit or state. They were most clearly developed along the Tswana of Central and Western Highveld. Their capital town had a population of about 15,000 to 20,000 by the late 18th century, so a sizable civilization. The southeastern Lowveld, so if we look to the map over there on the left, that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. The Highveld is to the south of the Lowveld. Geographically, there's a higher rainfall in this region. It's also hillier, and so you don't see the big civilization like you would to the south. You see mainly small family-sized homesteads that are able to live almost independently from one another. And by the late 18th century, the chiefdoms of the chieftains of the northern New Guinea are amalgamated into 3 kingdoms of this region. So again, not a whole lot of unity as you're pushing up to the east towards the civilization of Ethiopia. But that is the situation of South Africa just prior to colonization, which would be a topic for another class that maybe you would take. But officially, this is our last lecture for this class. So hopefully you're able to hang in there. Remember that there's no quiz on this, but this is covered on your final, so make sure that you pay attention to your study guide and know specifically the things that are noted on there from this unit.